Let me welcome economist Daren Conrad. He holds a BA, MA, and PhD in economics from Howard University, Washington, D.C., and is a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, holding that PhD in economics with a focus on development economics, on monetary and fiscal economics. Dr. Conrad, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much.
You have been rather busy these past couple of days, and I guess that's what happens when you've got an economist and you've got a Minister of Finance giving the country what many feel is a necessary budget. Some may find it a bit unpalatable accordingly, but sir, it is good to have you here. Welcome for the first time. Minister of Finance Coleman Wood said that total expenditure for the 2016 fiscal year has been tightly managed down to an estimated $52.2 billion, which was $11 billion less than the original expenditure. This is a step in the right direction, many would say, but clearly with dwindling revenue options, internationally depressed oil prices, and a controlled environment for gas, the budget necessitated deeper expenditure control and more rapid revenue diversification. This, of course, requires careful manipulation to avoid the chaos of social dislocation, which is always a real problem when you have to give bitter medicine, as it were. Against this background, what is your view and overall rating of the 2017-2018 budget?
Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me, and good morning to the listeners of the program. My general consensus is that we are moving in the right direction by way of realigning the expenditures with the revenues. But I think there are also some major challenges that would lie therein, and some of the other things that we might need to pay more attention to rather than just the macro figures, because they mask some of the major challenges that we face. Because when we look at the budget in general, it's sort of the realigning of the expenditure with the revenue. But one of the often overlooked factors is the revenue, the non-oil revenue versus the oil revenue. And when we look at the decline in the non-oil revenue, that is of particular concern, because remember, the non-oil sector has been running a deficit. And that deficit of the non-oil sector has been in the vicinity of 11 and 12%. It's down from about 20% deficit in the non-energy sector, but that 12% deficit is still not manageable, I think. In countries that that are resource rich, that non-oil or non-resource deficit is considered manageable if down to the range of 5%. So I think we have a lot more to do by way of revenue generation, and more so by the general cuts that we alluded to earlier on. I think there ought to be some more fiscal adjustments, but we'll talk about that.
You were up at the university, I believe it was yesterday, and it was there where you said this whole issue of devaluation is not something that's good for the country right now. I raised that by way of going to, I guess, probably echoing what you just said. It is one thing to see the draconian measures you must take, but when you balance that on the social dislocation, you have to temper it. So sometimes, while it is not because there's no panacea, as it were, it is not the begin all and end all of anything, but it is a step in the right direction. It does raise a question en route to finding that balance, as it were, of balancing the pain, dislocation, and the imperative. The burden of adjustment being shared equally. Would you say that budget that was just delivered strikes a closer balance to equity?
Well, I think in principle, we can think that it may strike that balance. But a lot of times with macroeconomic policies, we would see what often happens in the mechanisms being at work. We would see what naturally happens is that the burden shifts disproportionately to a particular sector, and I speak about that in particular. Most of the burdens are shared disproportionately, and that's not just in Trinidad, that's in general. Burdens are disproportionately shared by the lower income individuals. So that is how it's well intended, but I think how it ends up being in terms of who bears the burden is not necessarily going to be as we think it should be.
It is interesting that you say that. The voice you're hearing is that of economist Dr. Daren Conrad. He's our guest this morning. It's interesting that you say that, because on the one hand, while folks say, oh, it may seem to be off the top that they are asked to pay more via corporation tax, etc., it is going to be passed back down to the average man. So invariably, their profit margins are not really going to change, but how much the average man is paying for this is indirectly he's paying for their tax participation, what they've been requested to put in?
Well, my concern with those corporate taxes is not necessarily what is going to be passed on to the average man in the street. I think firms are a little bit more creative in minimizing their cost. My concern is that when they make the adjustment, not necessarily passing that adjustment to consumers, but there are other ways they can make an adjustment which would not directly impact the consumers. For example, a lot of these multi-million dollar corporations or billion-dollar corporations, they have their own corporate social responsibility programs. Now, we do not have a national corporate social responsibility policy. So they take that as their, giving back to the society. And they can cut costs in that regard. So that's not a cost that is going to be passed on to the consumers, but they can very well scale back their corporate social responsibility activities. And I think that this is what leads me to one of the main things I've been saying is that certain adjustments can be made if we have the structural framework or regulatory frameworks in place. So, for instance, if we were to have a corporate social responsibility policy at the national level, where we would utilize that to sort of let the companies undertake projects that would help to mitigate some of the negative impacts that would be felt at the macro level, then that can be a useful mechanism there. But where we don't have one, and then firms engage at their own discretion with whatever revenues or profits they generate, then they can scale back in those areas. And rightly so, the society will be a little bit disadvantaged in that regard, because we look to them for sponsorship of a number of activities, and they can very well scale that budget back.
Am I correct that this resembles the Community Reinvestment Act as is used in the United States in some places?
Well, in some instances, yeah.
Yes, because then you have an actually identified reinvestment percentage, which you're saying that takes away this thing of I will give 10 and you will give 20 and you will give 30%, and it's a sort of arbitrary kind of thing.
Right. So again, we don't have those sort of regulatory frameworks in place. So that's one of the ways that we stand to lose. So that is more of a concern to me than any cost that may be passed on. I think the firms are more creative at absorbing costs than anything else.
We're still talking about the budget presentation. We're going to be talking about that for the next 25 minutes. I want to get into the area of this question of 30 to 35%. Some businesses are saying it will be stifling. That may be a detailed or a one-word answer. Do you find that stifling?
Well,
the increase from 30 to 35.
With an economist, we can never say the answer is never yes or no. It's always given the circumstances. And I would listen. When we talk about these taxes, we have to realize that price is a rationing mechanism. So if it is that these companies are then faced with higher corporate taxes, I think that can, at this point in time, it can be a sort of a disincentive. Primarily because what should happen is that firms should actually be looking at how to better utilize their resources and minimize their costs. And so having an added tax at this point in time may not necessarily work in their favor at this point in time. But realistically, what can happen? Again, we do not have frameworks in place. So, for example, it can easily be passed on to the consumers. If you had regulatory frameworks in place and a little bit more oversight on how these pricing mechanisms work, then we can safely say that, all right, firms would then, in that instance, not be able to necessarily pass it on to the consumers, but they would begin to think about how they can minimize their costs in some regards and what they can do differently by way of allocative efficiency. So, for example, firms may want to begin to sell service. So you should see improvements in service, the quality of service that you get at any retail outlet. And that should be an attraction. So we look at different ways to attract consumers rather than, the run-in-the-mill, just have a, operation up and one or two people attending to customers and sometimes not acknowledging customers. So those are some of the things that would improve efficiencies.
I know it sounds kind of jaded, but I'm actually seeing my parallel universe in the area of increased service. but forgive me, I'm a little jaded here. I want to, because I've got to do quick steps with you.
Sure.
Listeners, what I'm doing is I'm exploring with our economists some of the components and the statements made for or against them, and then we'll come down to the area of the good parts of the budget and the good parts about our direction. Just bear with me. Some in the gaming industry, just on the area here of sharing the responsibility. Some in the gaming industry claim that they pay taxes. The real question, of course, should be, are they paying a fair percentage? The gaming industry, however, claims the tax levied on it will kill the industry and endanger the livelihood of thousands of workers directly and indirectly. From what you have heard levied from the Minister of Finance, are they crying wolf? That is the gaming industry, or there is some credence, some credit in what they're saying?
Well, I've been listening to the conversations and the notifications coming out from the industry since the budget has been read. And of course, no one is going to be in favor of additional taxes. Mm-hmm. And but I do think what is going to happen is a natural realignment. I know that a number of these casinos have popped up all over the place. And sometimes, again, in terms of allocative efficiency, this may now realign. And again, when we think about, some of them have been indicating that there may be job losses in the sector. These things are natural realignments in terms of allocative efficiency, and I keep saying that. And one of the things that is missing, I think, in our entire paradigm, and I'm going with the keeping the theme, the changing the paradigm. I think that what has to happen is that there has to be some sort of education for sustainable development. We have not undertaken that. And I listened to the minister earlier on the program talking about our problem is not food production, it's food consumption. Well, what happens with an education for sustainable development is that it trains people and exposes them to some of the outcomes of the decisions that they may make, whereas it would be local consumption versus foreign consumption. And education for sustainable development. And I think also the budget, the way it was presented, let's say, for instance, going up front, indicating all of the strengths, the opportunities, some of the weaknesses within the system, and then you had the fiscal measures. But I think what we fail to remember is that there is a 2030 plan. And that 2030 plan has about 5 or 6 thematic areas. Mm-hmm. And I think what would be useful, as is done in a private enterprise, what might be useful is to present it in such a way that people can see how these steps are positioning us in a path that would be aligned with that 2030 plan. That gap is missing.
Performance reports as we go.
Pretty
yes.
much, Mm-hmm. So let's say, for instance, this is phase 1 of this. This is phase 2. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, what was read in this budget would have been phase whatever. In the prior budget phase, whatever. I don't know how it would pan out in phases, but let the general public know by way of education, this is where it's going. So
it is one of the problems we see here that we don't see with more progressive governments. This whole area of understanding the importance of having your major machinery of your government and your plans being a good PR agency. Having people who can come and bring the message to the citizenry, so people are walking with you instead of hearing you saying where you're going and walking almost blindly. I got your point very clearly. My guest is Daren Conrad. He has an MBA in economics from Howard University, Washington, D.C., and a concentration in development economics and urban economics. Oil and gas subsidies, I want to get to that. A massive part of the expense of Trinidad and Tobago is subsidies. While not completely removed, the question amidst some of the protests we're hearing, so the question before you, Mr. Economist, is, was there an easier way to confront the reality that we can no longer continue these subsidies?
And again, this is another area where we have sort of been misguided in our thinking about the role of subsidies and taxes in a general economic sense. So, for instance, aside from some of the traditional forms of taxation, income tax and all of the sales tax and whatnot, taxes actually act as a corrective mechanism. And so wherein you have individuals engaged in an activity that can lead to a negative outcome, that is generally an activity that will be taxed at a particular rate, which is called the marginal external cost rate. And subsidy is generally provided where there's a favorable outcome. So, for instance, if it is that we have an externality, a negative externality being generated by activity, that is not subsidized, that's generally taxed. So again, in principle, when we are subsidizing something like fuel and electricity, it means that there is some probably favorable outcome from its use. And if we think to one of the challenges we have, which is congestion, again, congestion is not something you would want to subsidize. That is something you would want to tax at the marginal external cost rate. So in some countries, you would have fuel not subsidized, in addition to which you have road tax or other taxes associated with congestion. We have a fuel subsidy, which means that we are thinking, in principle, there is some positive outcome with the use of that subsidy. It is not the case. So what would happen is that if a subsidy is removed, the pricing mechanism will ensure that we use the resources effectively. And it's because we want to get to that place of allocative efficiency. So what would happen is that it would become a little bit more expensive. The cost of fuel will become a little bit higher, and that would act as a deterrent in some instances. And so we would begin to readjust in how we use it. We'll be more mindful. And again, we'll get to some allocative efficiency level within the system. So the whole idea of repealing subsidies gradually, I think that gets us back to the actual place where the market mechanism determines the prices, rather than being subsidized and using it in a way that is not necessarily allocative. I'll give you a quick example. In some instances, people say that, when there's a hurricane impending, or so, people take the prices of water up and whatnot. Some people argue that that's price gouging and whatnot. Some economists will tell you that that isn't the market mechanism at work. So if you know that the price increases substantially, you will make sure that you use that water for what it's intended for, and you will use it very, very, very discreetly and in terms of what it's for. You'll be very efficient in your allocation with that resource. But if it were to remain at that low price, then you may use it on the off chance. You may do something that you would not have necessarily done with it.
That is the best justification for gouging I have ever heard.
So the market mechanism, the pricing mechanism is what rations goods out, and what determines allocative efficiency. And we see that. So for example, if we were to have a faucet that sprang a leak at home, how long before you get that leak repaired? That's a resource that is being wasted until that leak is repaired. But because the cost is so low, that leak can go unattended for days, months, weeks, because we know that there's no real penalty associated with it. So if we had water meters, you would get that leak repaired very quickly, and so our resources would be allocated effectively.
You achieve behavioral modification. That's what you're doing. My guest is the holder of an MA in economics at Howard University, as aforementioned. He is Daren Conrad. I want to go into an area here of housing, which is an area that the government recognize 150,000 citizens on the waiting list of the HDC right now. The minister said government would return to the HDC its moorings, which is affordable housing. An incentive for additional low-income housing will include the private sector building on their own land and financial resources, with a 100,000 cash bonus incentive upon completion of these units. He said this will still save the government a whole lot of money. Will this move have the desired effect of generating activity on the ground, Daren Conrad? And will it have that effect on the one hand? And will private enterprise, private businesses find this really attractive and move towards doing this?
Now, again, these are often good intentions, and I think how it's done and how it's rolled out is a cause for concern. While good in principle, I think the way in which it is proposed that it be rolled out, I think I heard there was talk about a ministerial committee being responsible for that. And I think that is where we see a good intention that can go pretty wrong very quickly. We do not have an extremely large population. We have a population that we're probably 2 degrees of separation in terms of a name association with someone else. So to say that makes it an equitable system, I am concerned in that regard. And again, chances are, I'm not saying that it will intentionally pan out that way, but I think that may not necessarily be the most effective way to go about administering that. And where housing is concerned, again, we have created another market phenomenon that I don't think we can adjust quickly in that regard. We have a challenge with the supply of housing, the housing stock. And because the governments past have taken on the responsibility of providing housing stock, that invariably has driven the cost of production up, because they're the ones purchasing the raw materials. And so we have private sector trying to compete with those the high demand from the government side. So the supply of housing stock on the private level has been compromised to a large extent. So again, if you have the issue of housing for the low income earners, my fear is that the middle income earners would not have an opportunity fairly within the system to own a home, because by virtue of the private supply being so low, the prices would be extremely high. And so if you take care of the low income individuals, rightly so with rental units, we have a shortage of rental unit stocks. So I think addressing that is one part of the problem. But the other issue is that on the middle income end, they will not necessarily qualify for the low income housing, and they will not have the resources to afford the limited supply of private housing stock available to them. So again, that creates problems within the system.
The extractive industry is our discussion with Victor Hart. He will be following our discussion right now with my with my guest. And I want to go into the area of what you have heard and 3 areas you think we will have to, one, ensure that we, in fact, execute, which is the BIR. I'm going to ask you about the ambition of the minister in the area of the BIR. With the best army, he said on Friday night, the best army out there, we will collect about 40 billion.
Listen, our problem, and I kept saying this all along, I think as far back as 5 years ago when I first came back, our problem is collection. That has always been our problem, collection of tax revenues. That's our problem. We have a lot of leakages there. And I think compliance, again, is our major challenge. Now, I have heard of talk of... so I think although there are some the initiatives on point to increase the amount of taxes we collect, I think the collection is where we will fall short. And that has been the issue. And I know that in the last budget there was a talk of a revenue authority, and currently there's another talk of a revenue authority. But when we think about that, if we do some digging and you do some research on revenue authorities, there are a number of countries that implemented a revenue authority, where we are not the first to be proposing this. And what happened is in those instances, we always look at the theoretical framework and then we look at case studies. And in the instances where revenue authority was implemented, the revenue in the year of implementation increased, the revenue collection increased by 20%, but unfortunately it was not sustainable. The World Customs Organization did a further review, and they indicated that in an institutional framework where there is no revenue authority, the country can benefit and increase collection by simply making adjustments to the revenue collection scheme, which in our instance is the existing board of. They can make some adjustments to that to include elements of a revenue authority without implementing a revenue authority, and still benefit in a more sustained way from those elements. So we don't necessarily need to implement a whole new authority, but we can take into consideration amending it to incorporate some of those dimensions of the revenue authority in the existing system. And this is what I keep pointing to. We have so many loopholes in the system that we're not capturing. We want to create efficiencies, which is what I think is very important. So while there may be cuts, yes, there are cuts in the government expenditure. I wonder if these cuts are reflective of increases in efficiencies or simply cuts in, let's say, programs, manpower, whatever it may be. I would hope that these cuts were reflective of improvements in efficiencies.
I think that has been articulated, but one of the areas I want to zoom into, Doctor, is this area of, if you were in fact on your best day, by the minister's own admission, going to realize $40 billion, you still have a budget of 50.5 billion. You are still looking at a shortfall of about $10 billion. Where are we hoping to get this from?
And this is
the
thing,
said?
and this is what I'm getting to exactly with those the improvements in efficiencies, because improvements in efficiencies naturally result in reduction in costs, in operating costs. And so if we improve efficiencies at all levels, we would be able to reduce the operating cost, and with the current revenue stream, probably reduce the operating cost so much so that it realigns with the revenue that we have.
I'm going to have to ask you back because this conversation is going to take a longer time.
And I'll give you an example, a quick example again. We talk about the means test for GATE. And I don't even think that we have to go the way of a means test on it. I threw the idea out to a class a couple of days ago. Anyone who is applying for GATE, why is it that we do not have to, if you're applying for GATE, if as an individual, why is it you don't have to provide proof of your tax returns for the last 5 years? that forces a little bit of compliance in that regard. And even if you say, well, okay, I am self-employed, well, there are ways to report and pay taxes on those individuals as well. So why not show me proof? So in other words, again, a subsidy is a reward for good behavior and for positive outcomes. So yes, I am paying my taxes and I am complicit with everything else. So I will go ahead and now apply for funding for tertiary education. Again, those are some of the ways that we can improve our frameworks. And again, we've gotten so used to not adhering to or not complying that this is costing us a whole lot more. As a matter of fact, one of my colleagues I heard talk about the level of efficiency and our efficiency losses. And it was very shocking to know what our efficiency losses are. It's significant. And again, we go back to everything points to efficiency losses. If we were even to correct our whole approach to productivity levels, the last report I saw was 2011 through 2012 or something like that, a labor report. And labor productivity was projected to increase by 0.01% or something like that up until 2020. And if you look at that compared to a 12% raise by some, an 8% raise, I mean, what is the justification for so doing? So why not go ahead, tie public servant salaries to the price index, and then let everything else move to merit-based? Any increases subsequent to that. So you will keep the real purchasing power at best constant, and then merit increases would then adjust for those increases commensurate with increases in productivity. So again, it's all about allocative and productive efficiency. It's very basic.
As an economist, you would advise me that anything I come up with, I should leave a plus or minus 10%. I think I've blown my plus 10% on time. With one final question with a short answer if possible, and I know that's not really the fairest thing to ask you, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Any one thing you heard that was left out of the budget that you saw as an imperative for the nation? Anything that was not mentioned in that to bring us all properly in line with this reality check, as it were?
Well, I know a lot of people would not be prepared to hear this one, so I have to prefix it and be very careful of it, and I think the time will come, but I think there should have been, rather than the corporate tax, a nominal upward adjustment in income taxes. But I think that may come out later on subsequently. But I think if we look and compare ourselves to where the rest of the world is, we get off rather easy.
Let me just look across at my producer. It looks as though we have a good program between him and Mr. Roger at some point.
No, well, one thing I want to mention before I leave, and I know time is up upon us, but this week coming, we have the conference on the economy at the University of the West Indies. And that runs from the 11th, and that's on the 11th and 12th. And during that conference, we'll explore issues in human resource development in the region, export-led growth in the region, as well as survival of states in a developing world. So it will address some of the major issues that we've talked about here today in great detail. The academic presentations will be based on individuals coming from across the region. And so I would encourage people to come out and hear. I mean, there is a cost associated with it. For one day, it would be $800, but if you wanted to attend for both days, it would be $1,500, and that would include meals and refreshments as well.
A good way to expand the conversation and get into detailed discussion on it. It is your first time with us, Dr. Daren Conrad. I thank you so much for taking the time to be with me this morning, and hopefully we'll do it again.
Thank you very much.
I thank you so very much.